Hello there, and thanks for watching my video on intermediate Excel functions. I'm Sean Geringer, and I'm going to be showing you some functions that you can use in Excel to analyze and view data. Let's get started. Now, before we get started, I would like to encourage you to download the example worksheet, which I have posted a link to in the comments field for this YouTube video. The example worksheet that we will be using will be necessary to follow the steps in some of the demonstrations. So just go ahead and make sure that you've downloaded the example worksheet so that you can follow along on your own computer. Now here's what we're going to cover in Excel. We're going to start by showing the text to columns feature. Then we'll do a sort and filter. Then we'll work with named tables. Then I'll demonstrate the if and if-error functions that are present in Excel. I will touch on some introduction to Booleans, and then I'll show you the Vlookup function, a very useful function in Excel. And finally, we'll wrap by creating a pivot table and then using the pivot table to drive a unique count. Let's go ahead and get started. The first feature I'm going to show you in Excel is text to columns. You can use text to columns to convert a text file into a spreadsheet. Now this can be delimited or the fields can be fixed with. Let me go ahead and demonstrate. This is the first tab in my example worksheet. Make sure that you look down at the bottom of your Excel screen at the various worksheets that are present in this file. Make sure you are on text to call number 1. Now you can see that in this first worksheet we have 2 rows, and these rows are made up of a single cell. This single cell contains a bunch of different data fields. We would like to convert this into a format so that we can manipulate this as if it was a regular spreadsheet. Believe it or not, this is actually quite simple in Excel and can be done with just a few keystrokes. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the fields that I want to convert. Now in this case, there's only 2 rows that I want to convert. If there's more than 2, you could select the entire column and it will do the work for all the rows in that column. I'm going to navigate to the Data tab in my Excel ribbon. And then I'm going to use the Text to Columns button, which is located in the Data tab. Now for this first example, our data is fixed with. You can see in the preview of selected data that all the data lines up. So I'm going to go ahead and select fixed with and hit next. Now Excel attempts to determine where each column is. And it looks like it did a fairly good job. I'm going to move this by clicking on the arrow and dragging the line. I find that it's usually easiest to have the blank space be after the text in a column. Now in this case, Excel added an extra column. This should be 71 plus in the same one. I can double click this line and it will disappear. Let me move the rest of these. Now I can go ahead and hit the next key. Now Excel is asking me some questions about the data. You can see that it started with this first column and it's asking the data format. We can leave general for that and general for that. The only thing that I would like to change is the date field. Now you can see the various options for date, and month, year is not an option. So unfortunately, we'll have to leave that at general and take care of that later. Go ahead and select finish. You can see that now Excel has actually automatically moved everything into separate columns. We can make it more readable by highlighting everything and double clicking. And you can see that Excel automatically figured out the date information. It's actually quite intelligent in that regard. So that's fixed width. Now let me show you delimited text. Let's go to text_call_2 worksheet. In this worksheet, you'll see that we have similar text to before. In this case, instead of a space between each column, we have a line, or actually what's called in computer lingo a pipe, which is a vertical line character. Again, this is quite straightforward to convert. I'm going to select the column that contains all of the text, and I'm going to select text to columns. Now in this case, I would like to make sure that delimited is selected. Now it's asking what is the character that separates the fields? What is the delimiter? Now by default, Excel assumes that the delimiter is going to be a tab. In this example, that is not the case, so I'll uncheck that. You'll see the defaults that Excel will use are tab, semicolon, comma, and space. There's also an other field, and that's what we're going to select. And I'm going to go ahead and add my pipe character to that. And you'll see that it automatically, under the data preview, has started to manipulate the data. You'll also see that there's a drop down for text qualifier. You can see what this is if you look at the 71 plus column. In this column, the text is surrounded by quotation marks. So I need to make sure that my text qualifier is set to quotation marks. Hit next, and again we are given the data format screen, and for this screen we can just click finish. And again, I'll select the columns and double click one to resize, and you'll see that Excel has done a good job of converting that text into the actual columns. So that is how you use the text to columns feature in Excel. Now let's go on to sort and filter. Sort and filter allows you to easily filter large amounts of data through the use of drop-down menus. Before you can use sort and filter, you need to clean up your data and create appropriate headings. And then you can enable the sort and filter feature. Let's go ahead and begin with sort and filter. Now, I've moved to the next tab in the worksheet, which is Sort and Filter tab. And in this, you can see that we have a bunch of voter data. As I said, before we can get started, we need to clean up our data. And that means that we need to make sure that there's no blank lines anywhere in our data. If there's a blank line, it will break the Sort and Filter feature. Now, I could scroll through all of this data. There is quite a lot. And make sure that there's no blank lines. There's an easier way though. If you click on the very top row of the data, you can quickly jump to the first blank line by pressing the End key and then pressing the down arrow. So press End and release and then press the down arrow. And you'll see I've gone down to line 4000. And if I scroll down, there's no more text below that. For instance, if I was to delete a line and try this again, I'll click on the first row, I'll press my end and down arrow, you'll see that I jump down to the first blank line. And if I scroll down, I see that there's more data below that. That's how you can tell if there's any blank lines in your data. Now I'm going to use the undo to add that data back. Now the second requirement for using the data filter is that we must have headings in our data. This data does not have any headings. So I will click on the first row and then right click and choose Insert to insert a blank row. Now I'll add some data headings. This first column is voter ID number. The second column is party. The third column is precinct. The fourth column is age. The fifth column is last voted date. The sixth column is registered years. And the seventh column is voter type. Now that we have headings created for our data, we can go ahead and enable the filter function. Select all of the columns that you would like to be able to filter. And again, under the Data tab, select the Filter button. You'll see what happened is we now have these drop-down arrows next to the headings. I'm going to expand these a little bit. Each of these arrows will allow us to filter the data based on the various options that exist within the selection. So for instance, if we wanted to filter the party, we can drop down the party menu and you'll see that we have the various options that exist in that selection. I can uncheck Select All and check to view only Democrats. Or I could do the same thing and select Republicans and Green Party members. I could do the same thing for precinct. You can combine filters as well. I have filtered precinct for precinct 2414, and now I can further filter based on Democrat. You can also clear all filters by selecting the Clear Filters From. Finally, within this function, you can also sort the data. Let's say we wanted to sort the data by precinct number. Under this drop-down, you'll see at the top, Sort Smallest to Largest and Sort Largest to Smallest. What we've done is now sorted all of our data based on this field. And you'll see that the precinct numbers are all combined together now. That is how you use the sort and filter function in Excel. Now let's discuss the use of named tables. Named tables are subranges of data in Excel. There is some distinct advantages that you'll see to using named tables. Firstly, they make writing formulas much easier because the data sets will be easier to follow. Let me demonstrate how named tables work. First, I've gone to my Named Table tab in my worksheet. You'll see on this tab I have a small amount of data. I have a table that contains a precinct number and the location name. To create a named table, go to the Insert tab in your Excel ribbon. Select the data that makes up your table and click on the Table button. Now review this pop-up menu. It's asking you where is the data for your table, and it's telling us that it's selected A1 to B6. So A1 is this cell and B6 is this cell. And then it says my table has headers, which is important because this table does have headers. So we need to make sure that that box is checked. Go ahead and click OK. Now you'll see that we're in the Table Design menu. First thing that we want to change is the table name, which is here at the top left. I'm going to call this Precinct Lookup. You'll also see that there's a bunch of advanced tools for tables here, and it's automatically applied some formatting to our table. It's also added the sort and filter functionality automatically as well. Name tables are very, very handy. But in this circumstance, That's all we need to do for now, and we'll come back and use this named table later. The next thing that we're going to discuss is if functions. If functions are the foundation of using Excel for logical decisions. I bet you didn't realize that Excel can automatically answer questions for you if you phrase them in the form of an if question. An if question is something that is similar to what I have defined there. If the cell A1 is greater than 2, display the text larger than 2. If it's not, display the text smaller than 2. The if function has a closely related function, the if-err function, and I'll demonstrate that as well. Make sure that you're on the if function worksheet in your Excel spreadsheet. This is pretty basic, and we simply have a list of numbers. What I'm going to do is write an if function that will display if the text in the cell is larger than 2. I'm going to start by clicking into B1. This is where I want to have my formula. I'm going to start by telling Excel that I'm going to be entering a formula. So I'm going to press the enter or the equals key, and then I'm going to start with typing if. You'll see that Excel automatically displays the various formulas that start with the word if, and it also says what it does. Checks whether a condition is met and returns one value if true and another value if false. All functions are surrounded by a parenthesis, so I will start with a left parenthesis, and it begins to tell me what I need to do. So it's telling me that the first field is a logical test. So I am going to click into cell A1, and then I'm going to press the greater than symbol, and I'm going to type the number 2. So my logical test is A1 is greater than 2. The value I want to display if true will be the word greater than 2. So I will put a quotation mark to designate that this is a text string and type greater than 2. Now the value that I want it to display if false is another text string. I'll again put quotation mark and then type less than 2. And finally, I will end with the right parenthesis. You can see that Excel went ahead and evaluated that if statement and has come up with less than 2. Now, I could go ahead and type the same thing in all of these other cells. But there's a simpler way to go about this. I can click the bottom right corner, and if you see when I mouse over that, my mouse changes from a thick plus symbol to a thin plus symbol. If I click on that button and drag down, Excel will automatically generate all of the other formulas that are necessary to fill in the rest of those fields. We can click to see what it did. You can see that it's automatically incremented the cell that is being compared against in each of the subsequent formulas. Now there's another if function that I wanted to demonstrate for you. It's the if-err function. If-err is useful in quite a few situations where you want to have the output of a formula be very clean and not end up with error messages. I'm going to clear these out. So for this example, I'm going to use some division. Now, a common problem with division based on user inputted or cells that are in a spreadsheet is the possibility of a division by zero error. So for instance, if I was just to type in a simple formula like 9 divided by the cell contents of A1, we'd get this very gross div 0 error. Now, if I extend out that formula, it'll certainly work in the other fields, but this really doesn't look good. So let me demonstrate how we can go about using the if-error function to avoid that mess. Again, I'll start with my equals, and I'll put in if-error. Now in this case, if-error will return the value of the logical test that I've put in this field if there's no error, and it will return the second value if there is an error. So in this case, I'm going to put 9 divided by A0, or A1, and if there's an error, I'm going to tell it to just return no text. So 2 quotation marks with nothing between them. Now you'll see that for that first field, it displayed nothing. If I extend out that formula, you'll see that the formula actually displays the proper information in all the other fields. Like I said, that's a very useful function because it can make sure that data that's outputted is very clean and doesn't have any error messages contained within it. So that's the basics of if functions in Excel. Let's take it a little bit further into Booleans. Booleans are a continuation of using Excel for logical decisions. As you might have been able to tell from the way that if functions work, computers analyze data in binary, either a true, which is represented by a 1, or a false, which is represented by a 0. Once we've reduced our data to true or false, there's all sorts of logic that can be used on the data. Let me go ahead and demonstrate how this works. I'm going to make sure that we're on our Booleans tab. Now, by default, we have in this tab a list of falses. What we would like to do is use a Boolean logic to tell us if anything in a list is true. So basically, I've got all these falses, but these might be the outputs of an if function, and I'll demonstrate that here in a moment. So we would need a formula to tell us if something was to change, and maybe we have a true. This might be something like measuring a statistic, and you want to be alerted if something goes off from a standard. So there's actually a very simple formula that we can use for this. It's called COUNTIF. I'm going to click into cell A8. I'm going to start by an equals. And the formula is COUNTIF. COUNTIF tells us that it will count the number of cells within a range that meet the given condition. So first we need to define the range. In this case, the range is this, A1 to A7. And the criteria we're going to tell it is to count for any trues. Now you can see that right now it's telling us 0 because there's no trues in that data. If I was to go into this and change one of these falses to a true, all of a sudden that changes to a 1. Now let me show you another function that we can do with this. Rather than just using COUNTIF, let's combine COUNTIF with the if statement that we learned earlier. I'm going to start with if. Now, what I'd like to have it test is if there is any trues in that data. Again, that's the same as what we just did a second ago. We're going to do COUNTIF. I'm going to tell it the range is A1 to A7, and we're looking for true. Now, if that is greater than 0, so if there's more than 1, I would like to have it display the text event detected. If not, I would like to have it display the text all quiet. Now, I will need to end this with a second set of parentheses. That's because, actually, I guess not. Just one, sorry, I was misreading. So you can see that when we've entered in this formula, we have all falses here, and right now it's displaying all quiet. If I change one of these to true, event detected. Two of these is true, event detected. Doesn't matter how many, it will always display event detected. We could actually take this a step further, and you can have Excel return a true or false. Now, because those are Booleans, they don't need to be in quotes. And then you could do further Boolean logic on that. So you can kind of see the beginnings of what we might have, which would be a decision tree. Let me show you what I mean by that. So here's the data set that we had earlier when we were doing our if work. I'm going to start with the same formula that we did before, which is if the cell contents are greater than 2. Now this time I'll have it return either a true or false. So if E1 is greater than 2, return true. If not, return false. I'll extend that out. And now beside this, I'll go ahead and create another field. And I will use some Boolean logic here. This is also the same formula that we just learned a second ago. And again, I'll have it output true or false. Now, I labeled this with any fields greater than 2 so that I know what this field is displaying. And you can see that it's returned true because we have these fields that are greater than 2. We've got a 3, a 4, a 5, and a 6. Now, if I was to change all of these back to a 2, you see that automatically change to false, because in that circumstance, all of these fields are less than 2. They're actually equal to 2, which means that they're not greater than 2. If you remember back to high school math, greater than means that it has to be above the value. If it is the value, it's equals to, and that does not count as greater than. So that is the basics of Boolean logic. Boolean logic can be extended to all sorts of things in Excel. And it's really the foundation for a lot of logical tests that you can do in Excel. But let's move on to another Excel function. Vlookup. Vlookup is one of the more powerful Excel functions that you can use. It's used in advanced decision making. It has the ability to reference data in another data set. It also can be thought of as an extremely fast search capability built into Excel. With Vlookup, you can create detailed reports from multiple data sources, and it's the foundation for the idea that exists in databases called unions. Now let me show you how Vlookup works. So I am in the Vlookup tab in my Excel data, and you'll see we're back to our voter data. I've again selected the columns and double clicked on one of the widths to resize everything. Now in this data, we have a column that represents the voter precinct. If you remember back to our named table tab, we also created a named table, and in that named table we have a mapping of a precinct number to a location name. What if we wanted to add a column in this data that contained the precinct name? Well, you could manually go back and forth. Precinct 2408, you could go to our name table, 2408, that's Lynn County number 1, and you could type in Lynn County number 1, and you could do that over and over for each precinct. Maybe by using sort and filter, you could speed that up by combining everything, by making everything that's a similar precinct next to each other. But there's a much simpler way, and it's with the Vlookup function. Let me show you how Vlookup works. We're going to start by going back to our named table, and we need to go to the table tools so that we remember the name of our table. In this case, it's precinct lookup. Let's go back to our Vlookup tab. We're going to start with a formula. So we're going to start with the equals key. We're going to type in Vlookup. Looks for a value in the leftmost column of a table, and then returns a value in the same row from a column you specify. By default, the table must be sorted in an ascending order. That sounds pretty complex, and it really took me a long time to understand what this was doing, but I think you'll see after I fill in this data and explain what we're doing. So we're going to start with the parentheses. So the first thing that it's looking for is the lookup value. So this is actually the value that we want to find in the other data set. So in this case, it is C1. It is the precinct number. Now it wants to know the table array. This is the table that contains the data that we would like to reference. So that is in our named table tab. And it is in this table. So what I've done is I've gone to the name table tab and I've clicked into the table and I've selected column A and column B. And you'll see in the formula, it has automatically filled in named table A2 to B6. And you'll see that that lines up. A2 is the first field that contains data. B6 is the last field that contains data. We need to click back into the formula bar here at the top of the screen and press a comma. Now, it's asking us for the column index number. This is the column that contains the data that we want to return and display. So in this example, the precinct number is column number 1. The location text is column number 2. So in this field, I want to type in the number 2. Now the last field that we need to fill in will be true or false. Now this took me a long time to understand because every example you'll find online almost always uses false. What that means is that the data in this list is not in sequential order, and so it needs to search top to bottom and then return the match. If you put in true, it just searches from the top and finds the closest number that's to that value, even if there's a more accurate number further down in the list. So, and every time I've ever used VLOOKUP, I've always put false in this field. End it with the last parenthesis and press the enter key. You'll see what VLOOKUP did is it automatically returned Linn County 1 into this field. Now, what I could do is just drag this down and it will return the rest of the precinct names for the precinct numbers. You'll see it's automatically updated some values in the table. Now, you'll see that it's updated two things. It's first updated the cell, that's the lookup cell, C4. The other thing that is updated, which we don't want it to update, is the data that it's searching in. If you're astute, you'll notice that this top one is searching A2 to B6. This bottom one is searching A5 to B9. If we go back to our named table, the data is always in A2 to B6. What do we do about this? Well, there's actually a pretty straightforward thing that we can do. If we go back to this, I'm going to clear out these because these are incorrect. If we go back to this top formula, and if we click back into here, Excel can be told to not update the cell ranges for a specific cell when it is auto-populating a formula. And you do this by adding a character to the cell reference. The character that we're going to add is a $sign. The way this works is if you don't want it to change anything about the cell reference, you'll put a $sign before the column and the row. So in this case, I don't want it to change anything about the cell reference, so I'm going to put a $sign A, $sign 2. In some cases, you might want it to only stop from updating the column. And that would be something like if you were going to fill in data downwards, you would still need it to change the row, but you wouldn't want it to change the column. In that case, you would only put a $sign before the column, and you'd leave the row field unique by leaving the $sign off of it. That's a pretty special use case. I just wanted to point it out because it is quite handy if you ever run into that. But in this example, we don't want it to change anything. So we're going to put $signs on both row and column. Now, when I fill down this data, you'll see that the lookup value has changed each time. But the table that it's searching in has not. So it will always search the same data range. That is the Vlookup function in Excel. Let's move on. The final thing I want to cover is creating a pivot table. Now, pivot tables are incredibly useful for Excel. They can very rapidly show you all sorts of information about data that you have stored in Excel. However, there's some things to keep in mind when using pivot tables. First, the data that you're using must be clean, similar to the sort and filter. There cannot be any breaks in the data. So do the same thing that we did for the sort and filter and check to see if there's any blank lines in your data, and if so, remove them. Secondly, the data must have a heading. Pivot table will not work if you do not have a heading for your data. This might seem intuitive, but it's actually caused me a lot of problems. But the data must be saved in XLSX format before beginning. So if you have brought in data from a CSV file before creating a pivot table, make sure to use the Save As function in Excel to save it as an XLX workbook before continuing. All right, let's go ahead and demonstrate creating a pivot table. Creating a pivot table begins by selecting the data that you want to have defined in the pivot table. Now, unless you have a tremendous amount of data, it's usually best to just go ahead and select all the data. Data in pivot tables is selected by the entire column, so you always must select the entire column. In this example, we have just a few columns, so I'm going to select all of these columns. Then, under my Insert tab, I'm going to select the Pivot Table option. Now, the Create Pivot Table dialog box comes up and is asking me to select a table or range. You can see, since we've already selected the range that's in there, it's telling us A to G, column A to column G. And then by default, the pivot table is going to go into a new worksheet. And almost always that's what you want. So just go ahead and hit OK. Now this is the data that we see in our pivot table. This is probably somewhat different than anything you've ever seen in Excel. On the right-hand side of the pivot table are the fields. And these are taken from the headings that existed in the data that we've selected. Down below are the various ways you can manipulate this data. There's filters, there's columns, there's rows, and there's values. Let me show you how this works. The easiest thing is to demonstrate it for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the party to rows. Okay, if for some reason you can't drag party down to rows, which is normally how I do it, you can also check, you can click into rows and then check the box party. Okay, So what we've done is we have told it that we want a row for each party, and you'll see that it's populated all the unique values. Now, let's say we want to know how many voters are in each party. I can drag voter down to values. Now, by default, what it's done is it's told us that it's going to create a sum of the voters. Now, if we go back to our data, you'll see that the voter is their unique number. We don't need a sum of that field. What we actually need is a count of that field. So I'm going to drop down that menu and select Value Field Settings. I'm going to select Count. You'll see that it now says Count of Voter. That will count how many times somebody has, that a voter exists under that party. So now what you see is we have a row for each party, and it's displaying a total. Now, let's say we wanted to see that same data, but broken out by precinct. That is easily done as well. What we can do is add precinct to the columns field. What we've done now is we've told it to create a column for each precinct. Under every party, create a count of voters and tell us that information. So you'll see that with just a few clicks, we were able to go ahead and do all of that manipulation, and Excel has spit out the data that we need. You can additionally add a filter to your pivot table. Let's do that by dragging last voted and adding it to filters. Now you'll see at the top of our pivot table is a field last voted. If we drop that down, we could see just data for a specific election. So by default, we're on all, but let's say we wanted to see the data for November 2014. Now it will display just the data for that election. You can also check the box that says select multiple items and display data for multiple fields. Within the pivot table, you can also do other things as well. You can combine things. So for instance, we've now combined ballot status and last voted. And finally, you can create more than one set of rows. If we were to drag age group under party, we could get a further breakout of our voter data. We would see each party and each age group for each precinct. Play with this data set and see what other things you can create.